Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 131st of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the first week of September 2024. In today's podcast, last week Russia bombed several regions of Ukraine, killing dozens and wounding hundreds of civilians. We're also gonna talk about Ukraine holds while Ukraine holds its positions in the Kursk region, Russians continue to push through Pokrovsk direction. So Russian strike on the Ukrainian military academy kills dozens. Moscow launched missile and drone barrages on Monday night and Tuesday morning that killed dozens of people in three cities, according to Ukrainian officials. And Russia, late last month, unleashed one of its most sweeping aerial attacks since the war began in 2022, launching hundreds of missiles and drones toward at least 15 regions in one night. The deadliest recent incident came Monday night in the form of a double ballistic missile strike on the Poltava Military Communications Institute and a nearby hospital that killed more than 50 people and wounded hundreds. So, as a result of attack, two ballistic missiles blasted a military academy and nearby hospital in Tuesday in Ukraine, killing 55 people and wounding 328 others. This was one of the deadliest Russian strikes since the war began in February 2022. The missiles tore into the heart of the Poltava Military Institute of Communication main building, causing several stores to collapse. It didn't take long for the smell of smoke and word of the deadly strike to spread through the central eastern town. Ukrainian President Zelensky and the country Ministry of Defense said the two missiles hit the facility just after an air raid alert, and people didn't even have enough time to evacuate to a bomb shelter. One of the buildings of the institute was partially destroyed. People found themselves under the rubble, but many were saved. Hundreds of Ukrainians, including sobbing relatives, gathered at the Cathedral of the Assumption in Poltava a few days later, just mourn the 55 dead and the more than 300 injured in the Russian missile strike. The enemy didn't stop. The Putin's army wants more Ukrainians to die, including children. The right next day, the new Russian attack occurred in the western city of Lviv, killing seven civilians. A mother and her three daughters were among seven people killed in Ukraine's western city of Lviv during a fresh wave of Russian attacks. A baby and another girl were also killed. Last week, the day after the attack on Poltava Institute, Russia attacked Lviv with drones and hypersonic missiles early on Wednesday. The attack came as Ukraine reeled from Russia's deadliest single bombardment this year, a strike on the military institute that took away 55 people's lives. Explosions were also heard on Wednesday over the capital of Kiev as air defenses targeted Russian missiles. Also, a hotel in Kiev was struck by Russian missile, leaving at least 4 people dead and 5 injured. Overnight on September 4, Russians reported fired 42 drones and missiles against Ukraine, including two Kh-47 Kinjal missiles launched from MiG-31K aircraft, two Kh-22 cruise missiles launched from Tu-22M bomber planes, and six Kh-101 cruise missiles fired from Tu-95 bomber planes, and three Iskander K cruise missiles and 29 Shahed type kamikaze drones. Ukraine air defense intercepted 22 drones, 4 Kh-101 missiles, and 3 Iskander K missiles the air forces of Ukraine reported. 6 drones were lost, likely as a result of electronic warfare means, and one flew to Belarus, according to the statement. The attack on Lviv in the far west of Ukraine came as all of the Ukraine was under air raid alert. Witnesses said that the city was targeted at about 5:40 in the morning. Mayor of Lviv said the Russian attack had damaged more than 50 buildings in the historical heart of Lviv, including homes, schools, and clinics. The mayor posted a picture of a local family on social media saying that only the father has survived. His wife, Yevgenia, and their 3 daughters, Darina, Emilia, and 21-year-old Yarina, all were died in their home due to Russian attack. The Ukrainian Air Force said that Russia had fired 13 missiles and 29 attack drones, and that 7 cruise missiles and 22 drones were shot down. The mayor of Lviv city said some buildings were struck near the railway station in Lviv regional administration, and the residential buildings had been damaged due to attack. So now let's talk about what's happening in Donbass on the Pakrovsk direction, and what is happening in the Kursk direction in the Russian Federation. So, Russian offensive strategy in Pokrovsk. During the day, Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance notices up to 500 enemy infantrymen on the front line and in the immediate rear on the front of up to 18-kilometer wide. Some go forward, some go back, and some of them get fixed. That is, the enemy doesn't throw tank columns into the battle anymore, doesn't storm with companies. The advantage in numbers doesn't have multiple meanings anymore. The adversary's tactics are combat reconnaissance in small groups of 3 to 6 people in several directions under the control of a drone, combined with the destruction of our identified positions with drones and artillery. The Russians suffer significant losses, but somewhere they flow between our battle formations, somewhere ours retreat after eliminating several assault groups, somewhere ours retreat due to management problems, and the enemy quickly occupies empty positions. Because the Russians have several echelons of battle formations in the offensive and execution on the spot for refusing to attack, and we have battle formation in one echelon. Every register can be pushed through. You can stop the enemy with losses only if you equip the defense line and stop exchanging in counterattacks and in unequipped landings. Last week, almost all attention was forced on the Pokrovsk front, where the Russians broke through an essential line of defense of Ukraine is. Fortunately, as expected, the wild statement that the entire Donbass front has collapsed already look very premature. At least 2 relatively fresh brigades have appeared between the Russians and Pokrovsk, and the enemy's advance has slowed significantly over the past few days. Most of the territory captured by the Russians is southeast of Pokrovsk, where Moscow hopes to surround up to 4 Ukrainian brigades occupying positions west of the Vovcha River. As soon as the Ukrainian troops leave the open area, approaching the enemy position east of the Vovcha River, the front line will be significantly reduced, making it possible to concentrate significant combat forces to hold the Ukrainian Kurahivka area. This area should be well defended, with a good large reservoir covering the right flank and high ground in the rear. Even if Selidove falls, the Russians will find themselves sandwiched between 2 areas of high ground on entire flank. It is impossible to say whether Ukraine is building up powerful forces on this flank ahead of a counterattack, although The recent order to evacuate the civilian population in the area might indicate a desire to move troops there. That aside, a steady stream of drone footage taken on the outskirts of occupied Avdiivka suggests that Russian supply lines are becoming increasingly vulnerable as they advance west. Moscow's actions here are fully justified in a purely operational sense if their goal is to achieve progress at any cost. Pokrovsk is located on the outer edge of Ukraine's logistics network and the most vulnerable part of the entire front. But his loss, and it doesn't look like soon, will not break Ukraine's defense in Donbass. The Kursk area in the Russian Federation is an entirely different problem for Moscow. Losing a part of Mother Russia is already bad, but the longer Ukraine's occupation of the region lasts, the more difficult it will be to oust it completely. This front will become a nagging problem, a stick in Putin's side, a constant reminder to his people of how weak his regime really is. He should also take into account the possibility that Ukraine will do the same as in Bryansk, and the conscripts will surrender without a fight. In a strategic sense, the Kursk campaign fulfills not only this valuable goal, but also another important task to force Putin to allocate all resources that can be freed from fighting in occupied Ukraine. Responding to the situation in the Kursk region with a meager force of conscripts and brigades that are in the process of rebuilding from destruction and trying to distract from the whole disaster by clinging to Pokrovsk means that some other fronts will be left unreserved and vulnerable to a surprise attack. At the operational level, the Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk region has not yet reached its climax, but it can be expected to happen within 2 or 4 weeks. Ukraine prudently avoided the risk of overstretching by not hastily trying to break through Dolhovo and Rilsk. This probably kept the loss rate of combat power low, meaning that instead of 1% decline per day, Ukraine could see half of that, meaning that combat formations could maintain the same rate for 2 months instead of one. Ukraine doesn't need to take the risk of a rapid offensive when Moscow continues to transfer battalions to the front in parts. Although the soldiers arriving in the area have begun to launch larger and more organized counterattacks, the Ukrainian forces occupying strong positions are basically tearing them apart. Now it's obvious that hundreds of Putin's conscripts are cut off from the support, surrounded by Ukrainian fighting groups. Presumably, Ukraine is actively working to surround groups of conscripts and then set up a roadside ambushes for regular troops sent to help them. As before, there is talk of 2,000 prisoners, and Moscow is reportedly not averse to exchanging them for Ukrainians held captive to mitigate the negative political backsplash. Currently, Ukraine is simply relishing a golden opportunity to destroy the Russian forces' reserves while slowly suppressing the area south of the Seizm in the Hlushkova area to secure its western flank. Moscow sent several thousand soldiers here to join nearly 1,000 new recruits in danger of defeat, only for Ukraine to blow up the bridges connecting them to Rilsk. Since then, the invaders have built about a dozen pontoon bridges, but all of them have been blown up to pieces by Ukrainians using HIMARS and JDAM strikes. Ukraine manages to deliver its own planning bombs to the front line soon. MiG 29 jet and Su 27 fighters can approach a distance of up to 25 kilometers behind the front line, release the weapon after the vertical ascent, and still have a decent chance of returning home. This is happening despite the obvious efforts of the Russians to deploy additional air defense systems in the area. While it is still possible that Ukraine will retreat, the positions it took at the outset were intended to form the outer perimeter of the Free Kursk territory to the east and north. On these lines, Ukraine will push a little further into Russia as soon as the opportunity presents itself, mainly to buffer the defenses around Suja. In the west, Hlushkova will gradually come under Ukraine's control, while an offensive through Koreneva to Risk remains quite probable. Kursk and Pokrovsk directions remain the most intense areas of fighting. The big question is what other reserves Ukraine is prepared to send into the battle in September, and where it will strike. Moscow's strategic reserves have gone to Kursk, so once the operational reserves of each separate front are exhausted, effective forward progress must in most cases cease. Large stretches of the front line remains mostly calm, bearing mortar and grenade attacks, as resources are always limited and must be wisely concentrated for maximum effect. Russian airstrikes now shifted, concentrating most on the hottest fronts, reducing the effectiveness of Russian attacks on the Sever, Liman, Dnipro, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia fronts. All report daily ground attacks, but they are small enough to be repulsed. Chasiv also experienced near constant invaders' attempts to cross the key channel, but with no apparent success. Recently, Kupiansk has seen an intense and large-scale attacks by the Russians, who have focused on the two sectors that attract the most attention of Moscow throughout the year: Pishane in the southeast of Sinkiivka to the north of the city. The latter has undergone constant grinding, meter by meter, while the former fell a few weeks ago and has since become a springboard for apparent attempts to encircle Ukrainian forces operating a little further south. The Svatova region is a potential zone for an unexpected Ukrainian counteroffensive, and mostly the military analysts estimated that the proximity to the Russian bases across the international border would make it difficult to attack here. Now that Ukraine has demonstrated its ability to seize chunks of Russian territory, the line from Svatove in occupied Luhansk to Valuik in Belgorod region in Russian Federation could be vulnerable. So, in summing up the ground battles of early September, despite the slow increase in the average number of soldiers lost daily, Moscow's equipment losses have decreased recently. On the Pokrovsk front, the Russian successes mainly consisted in sending endless waves of infantry crawling over the bodies of those killed by cluster bombs and drones. They also use chemical grenades to make this conflict even more like World War One, except with drones involved. Putin's growing fear and frustration can be seen in the resumption of mass drone and missile strike on civilian targets in Ukraine. As part of its own campaign, Ukraine continued to strike oil facility and air bases on the Russian territory, even one or two power plants deep in Putin's empire, and all the way to Moscow. For example, an oil refinery Kirov, hundreds of kilometers east of Moscow, was attacked and damaged. At an oil depot in Rostov, located along the main highway connecting it to Moscow, a spectacular explosion occurred just as the fires at another oil depot in Rostov, which was destroyed by Ukraine, finally subsided. Eventually, Ukraine drone attacks will become a severe threat simply by forcing Moscow to use a vast number of air defense missiles. A strike drone is almost certainly cheaper than any missile. You will never achieve air superiority over a country the size of Russia or China, but there is a downside. You won't be able to defend all that airspace either. So the drones will keep coming until the old anti aircraft guns come back. Unfortunately, Moscow's missile and drone attacks are getting smarter. By scanning Ukraine air defense network with Shahid drones, Russians can pick out targets that lack sufficient protection. This is how the tragedy happened in Poltava, killing 55 people and wounding over 300. Ballistic missiles hit the military academy before the cadets had time to evacuate. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, please share with your friends.